What I want to do in this podcast is to give you an example of what I have in mind for your presentation slides. Now, as you know, you're supposed to, for each one of the ethical perspectives that are listed, you're supposed to pick one of the 5 legal areas and then select a particular legal issue, a case, or a statute inside that area and use the perspective to critically analyze and evaluate the legal issue in question. So what I want to do here in this particular little podcast is to give you an example of what I have in mind using deontology, which is number 3 on the list of ethical perspectives, and we're going to work on applying deontology to a particular case. So let's see how this works. All right, so we have deontology, and the legal area that we're going to be working in this example is number 1. You could use number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 in any case or statute from those other areas. But the one I've selected for our example here is ethical perspective number 3 and legal area number 1, which is prisoner access to the courts. And the specific case that I've selected out of prisoner access to the courts is Lewis versus Casey, which was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1996. So the first question I want you to address under that is why this case, or a statute, in this instance it's a case, why it's key. Well, Lewis versus Casey was a major due deference era ruling. It came on the heels of some cases such as Bounds versus Smith, where the court had decided during the hands-off period that prisoners were entitled to legal services, attorneys or law libraries, and in the absence of that, they had to be allowed to be assisted by jailhouse lawyers, other inmates who knew something about the law. So this is really a major due deference era ruling, and what the main thing Lewis versus Casey requires is that if prisoners want to allege that they were denied access to the courts on the basis of shortcomings of the prison's legal assistance programs, that could be the law library, it could mean opportunity to consult with persons trained in law, or even opportunities to work with jailhouse lawyers, before they can demonstrate that these shortcomings restricted their access, they have to demonstrate to the court that there was some kind of injury that was produced by the shortcoming of the legal assistance program. In other words, that they suffered an actual injury, or that their efforts to get their case into court were hampered. In other words, they got to show that had it not been for these shortcomings, and that these shortcomings had been improved, that they would have had more success getting their case in, or that they would have avoided some kind of an injury. Perhaps it was an assault or something that they experienced, or their property was destroyed, or whatever the case may have been. Now, Lewis versus Casey is important because it made it much easier for courts when they're considering the validity of prisoners' claims that they were denied access to the courts. It made it much easier for courts to dismiss those claims and say, well, no, you haven't demonstrated the shortcomings adequately because you haven't shown that the shortcoming of the legal assistance program, the fact that the law library wasn't as up to date perhaps as it should have been, that this resulted in some kind of an injury to you, or really hampered your efforts to get into court. So now, how would we apply deontology to that? Well, you'll remember deontology stresses the nature of a moral duty, and seeing whether something is ethical or not. It stresses looking at the nature of the moral duty and the intention of the actor. So from this perspective, something is moral if an actor was acting out of moral duty and had good aims or good intentions, even if the outcome turns out to be poor. Well, from the standpoint of government officials, court officials such as judges or government lawyers or prison officials, they would argue that our duty at the end of the day is to achieve a balance between protecting the rights of prisoners, which means obviously giving them some access to the courts when they have legitimate claims, but by the same token, we have to balance that need against that duty with the duty of keeping the load manageable for the court system and not encroaching too much on prison authorities' discretion. In other words, we can't just give prisoners totally free access to the courts. There have to be some parameters laid down, otherwise, the courts are going to overburdened, and there'll be a lot of frivolous claims that will just really clog up the system, and prison officials feel like they're constantly being second guessed. But from a prisoner's point of view, Lewis versus Casey would be evaluated from a deontology perspective by saying, well, we really as prisoners have a different view of duty and intention. That the main duty of the court system and prison officials ought to be to ensure that our constitutional rights are not walked on. And in order to ensure that, we've got to have access to the courts. We've got to have a way to get our cases into court. And your intention here in this case is really to unfairly obstruct our ability to do this, because that by requiring us to demonstrate as prisoners actual injury or harm, and to actually show how the shortcoming led to hampered efforts to get our cases into court. And this is something that's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for prisoners to do, particularly if they're uneducated and they really don't have an understanding of the legal system. They are really going to struggle to do that. So the prisoner's view would be quite a bit different here, as you can see, than the prison officials' view would be. So this is an example of how one would do this assignment, applying deontology, which is number 3 on your list of ethical perspectives, to number 1 area under correctional law, prisoner access to the courts, and specifically a major access ruling out of Arizona called Lewis versus Casey.